Hi, everyone. Um, I wanted to talk about a good sign that you are getting healthy. I recently had a setback and I had to remind myself of this lesson. So I wanted to share it because I haven't heard it a lot. The sign of you getting healthy from a setback, from PTSD, from an emotionally hard thing that you've gone through is how you respond to a trigger by intensity, frequency, and duration. Before I do, I'd like you to remember that um, don't be discouraged whenever you go back into something. Something reminds you of this situation or this person or this thing that happened, and you just feel like you went right back in there and you were sucked in and you tried everything you could to get out and you can't, like you're in there and you feel like, have I learned anything? Am I still wounded? Am I still just as bad as I was when it happened? Many times you're not, and most of the time you have done the work, and yes, the work is working. It's just that sometimes we expect that we should never ever ever feel pain ever again because we're healed. And I'm not certain that that's realistic. Another thing I would like to mention, because my suggestions involve you assessing your emotions. Remember that you can have multiple emotions at the same time, many times opposite. So, for example, getting out of a long-term relationship where that was kind of abusive or that was not good for you, you can feel relief, happiness, and sadness at the very same time. Sadness that it's over, sadness that you tried so hard and this didn't work, but relief that you are safe, relief that and happiness that things are now you can move on with your life. So keep that in mind. Emotions are not just one thing; they're just a mix and complex. So the first one is intensity, which is the strength and depth of the experience. What happens is that you start finding out that you're reducing in the intensity. You have to ask yourself when it first happened, how much did it affect your work or affect your relationships or other things? How much were you ruminating over it? How difficult was it for you to regulate your emotions whenever you were triggered? And I like using a 1 to 10 scale on my emotions, on my thought ruminations, and on my body reactions. I didn't have as much physical reactions other than numbness, but some people have stomach aches, some people have tremors, some people have all sorts of things. Rate it on a 1 to 10. And what you might find is that while you were in it, you were at a 9, a 10, overwhelmed. And then a couple of months later, you get to 8s. And then after a while, you start seeing that even all the triggers start moving lower and lower on the point. And I love giving an example of a long term relationship I was in where all the triggers concerning this person was always at a 10. All the anniversaries, all the birthdays, anybody who was a joint friend, anybody even just mentioning the name would get me at a high 7 or 8. And then 6 months later, joint friends could only put me at a 2 or 3. Um, Anniversary still got me very high into the 8s, into the 9s. And then a year later, the anniversary started putting me at a 5. And the friends were like at a 1. And then a year after that, I remember the anniversaries, there were a couple of anniversaries I completely forgot. And friends, not really, unless they kind of mentioned something like trying to get us back together or something of that sort. It just wasn't the same anymore. And so I started noticing that the intensity of my feelings every time I hit a trigger just dropped. The second thing I noticed was frequency, how often I was getting those strong emotions, how frequently they were happening. And once again, I talked about triggers. So, for example, at the beginning, it was every day. I was, there was crying every day. In many breakups, that's what happens. Every day there's a cry. There's a reminder. There's a T-shirt or a teddy bear or something you guys used to do on Saturdays or anniversaries or special days, and those will all cause triggers. Then what I started noticing was that it was only the deeply meaningful triggers that started hurting. So by a couple of months down the line, the small things like, oh, what we used to do on Saturdays, it didn't trigger me as much. Times of the day didn't trigger me as much. Birthdays and special days would trigger, but the day-to-day stuff, it just wasn't happening. And just the random sadness of being alone, what wouldn't happen as often. So the memory that, oh, I'm alone, and at the time I decided to take like a year off to heal. Over the months, that sadness of being alone stopped triggering me. It wasn't as frequent. Before it was every day. I remember, oh, I'm alone, I'm alone. Then it turned to every week. Then it turned to a couple of times a month. Then it turned to once a month. Then it turned to once a quarter. And then it turned to once or twice a year. So pay attention to that. And I suspect that that will also be helpful for you. And then the last one is the duration of the emotion. How long each sadness or emotional intensity lasted. Now, this one I remember because while I was in the relationship, I could go for a week in this sadness. And this one is a little bit hard to differentiate from the frequency because sometimes it was just frequent back to back to back to back to back triggers. And sometimes it was just one trigger, but it was so sad that it lasted a long time. So it might be tricky to differentiate. But what I found was that as I kept on doing my work, as I kept on healing, as I kept on focusing on understanding my emotions and retelling the stories around the breakup and just healing, those durations dropped. So what had turned from a 1 week malaise in the relationship turned to a 1 day malaise when I was out. So I would have hours. I'd probably be 5, 6 hours in sorrow. And then as a month or two passed, that 5 hours dropped to three, which dropped to 1 hour. And then even with a strong intensity thing like an anniversary, I would, where I had a 9 intensity of emotion, I could still go through the day and maybe have a 1 to 2 hour reaction. But then that happened once a year. So you see how all of those are combined, where I could have an infrequent, quick duration, high intensity trigger, or I could have a low intensity, mid frequent, low duration thing. So they're just looking at all three of them kind of help. And also, what helped was how well I learned how to emotionally regulate myself. And so, when the rumination would start and the trigger would show up, I would nearly get into it and then I'll stop myself and say, hey, you're going down this path. Is this the truth? What is the real story here? And it's okay. You're safe. You're going to be fine. And I found myself cutting short that duration from what would have been hours into like a 30-minute, I'm sad, I'm this and that. And even now, it's even easier for me to hold space and stay in that and be okay that I'm sad and not have to do anything. For me, for example, for me, chocolate and eating sweets, and not have to eat sweets or eat chocolate or go and binge or do something else to avoid sitting in that emotion. So I hope that's helpful and explanatory on something that I think will give encouragement that you are indeed healing from that.